The cradle's splintered wood caught the last dying embers of the sunset as Sarah Jameson clutched it to her chest, the only possession she had left after outlaws torched her family's homestead in the Montana Territory of 1876. Tears streamed down her face, leaving clean trails through the soot that darkened her once fair complexion. The small wooden cradle, lovingly crafted by her late father, had been meant for the child she'd hoped to have someday with her fiancé Thomas, before he was gunned down by the same gang that stole everything else. Sarah trudged along the dusty road leading away from the smoking ruins of her home, her simple cotton dress torn and singed at the hem. 20 years old and now completely alone, she had nowhere to go and no one to turn to in this unforgiving frontier. The nearest town, Cottonwood Springs, lay 15 miles ahead, but what awaited her there was uncertain. She had no money, no family, and nothing but a cradle that now served as a painful reminder of dreams turned to ash. Night was falling fast across the vast Montana landscape. Sarah knew she couldn't make it to town before darkness enveloped the trail completely. The sound of a wolf howling in the distance sent shivers down her spine. She veered off the main road toward a copse of cottonwoods near a creek, hoping to find shelter for the night. As she approached the trees, the unmistakable glow of a campfire caught her attention. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding against her ribs. Strangers could mean danger, especially for a young woman alone, but the alternative, spending the night exposed to the elements and wild animals, seemed equally perilous. Gathering what little courage she had left, Sarah inched closer to the campfire. A lone figure sat beside the flames, his back to her as he tended to a coffee pot. A wide-brimmed hat sat atop his head, and even in the dim light, she could make out broad shoulders beneath a worn leather vest. A twig snapped beneath her foot, and the man spun around, hand instantly moving to the revolver holstered at his hip. Sarah froze, the cradle clutched tightly to her chest like a shield. "Who's there?" The man's deep voice cut through the evening air. Sarah stepped forward into the light, her legs trembling. "Please, sir, I mean no harm. I'm just seeking shelter for the night." The man's hand relaxed away from his gun as he took in her appearance, clothes blackened with soot, face streaked with tears, and the strange sight of a cradle in her arms. He stood slowly, revealing his full height, well over 6 feet. "Name's Matthew O'Brien," he said, his voice softening slightly. "You look like you've been through hell, miss." "Sarah Jameson," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "And yes, I suppose I have." Matthew gestured toward the fire. "Well, Miss Jameson, I don't make a habit of turning away folks in need. Come on and warm yourself. Coffee's nearly ready, and I've got some beans and bacon to spare." Sarah approached cautiously, still clutching the cradle. The firelight revealed Matthew more clearly now, a man perhaps in his late 20s with sun-weathered skin, a strong jawline partially covered by stubble, and eyes the color of the Montana sky at dawn. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, marking him as a working cowboy rather than a drifter. "Thank you," Sarah said as she sank down on a log opposite him, the cradle balanced in her lap. Matthew nodded toward the cradle. "Expecting company?" he asked, his tone gentle despite the directness of his question. Sarah's fingers traced the smooth edge of the wooden cradle. "No, this is. It's all I have left. Outlaws burned my homestead today, killed my neighbors. I was out gathering berries when they came by the time I returned." Her voice broke, Matthew's expression darkened. "The Carson gang," Sarah looked up sharply. "You know of them." "Been terrorizing this territory for months now. I work for the Silver Creek Ranch about 30 miles north of here. Was on my way back from delivering a message to Fort Benton when I caught wind they were operating in these parts." He poured coffee into a tin cup and offered it to her. "I'm sorry about your home, Miss Jameson." Sarah accepted the cup, warming her hands around it. "They took everything. My parents died last winter from fever. My fiancé, Thomas, was shot 2 months ago when the gang raided the general store in Cottonwood Springs." The homestead was all I had left, and now. She glanced down at the cradle. My father made this. It was meant to be for my future. Matthew studied her for a long moment before silently dishing up a plate of beans and passing it to her. Eat, you'll need your strength. They ate in silence, the crackling fire and distant night sounds of the wilderness the only accompaniment to their simple meal. When Sarah had finished, Matthew took her plate and set it aside. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Cottonwood Springs, I suppose." "Though I don't know what I'll do once I get there. I have no money, no family." Matthew nodded thoughtfully, pouring himself more coffee. "I know the owner of the hotel there, Mrs. Peterson, good woman, might be able to give you work. You do that. Put in a word for me with a stranger." The corner of Matthew's mouth twitched upward. "Mrs. Peterson's no stranger, she's my aunt." For the first time that day, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "I'm handy with a needle and thread, and I can cook and clean." "I don't doubt it, but Cottonwood Springs is still a good day's ride from here." He glanced at the darkening sky. "You'll stay here tonight. I'll see you safely to town tomorrow." Sarah clutched the cradle tighter. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Matthew's eyes reflected the dancing flames as he looked at her. "Out here, Miss Jameson, folks have to look out for each other. It's the only way to survive." He stood, retrieving a bedroll from his pack. "Take my bedroll, I'll keep watch." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," he said firmly but not unkindly. "You've been through enough today. Get some rest." Too exhausted to argue further, Sarah accepted the bedroll, placing the cradle carefully beside her as she lay down. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as memories of smoke and flames flickered behind her closed eyelids. "Mr. O'Brien," she whispered after a while. "Just Matthew is fine," he replied from his position leaning against a tree trunk, rifle across his knees. "Matthew, have you ever lost everything?" There was a long pause before he answered. "Once, long time ago now. Does it ever stop hurting?" Another pause. "No. But you learn to build something new around the hurt, until one day you realize you've crafted a life again." Sarah turned to look at him, his profile silhouetted against the fire. "I don't know if I can. You will," he said with quiet certainty. "You survived today, that's the hardest part. Now get some sleep, Miss Jameson. Tomorrow's a new day." As Sarah drifted into an uneasy slumber, she found herself wondering about this quiet, steady cowboy who had appeared in her darkest hour like an answer to a prayer she hadn't even known to make. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Montana wilderness, rousing Sarah from her fitful sleep. For one blissful moment, she forgot the horrors of the previous day until her eyes fell upon the cradle beside her, and reality came crashing back. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. Matthew was already awake, tending to a fresh pot of coffee over a rekindled fire. His horse, a sturdy Appaloosa with distinctive spotted hindquarters, grazed nearby. "Morning," he said, glancing up at her. "Coffee's ready if you want some." Sarah pushed herself to her feet, brushing dust from her ruined dress. "Thank you." As she accepted the offered cup, she noticed Matthew studying her with a thoughtful expression. "What is it?" she asked. "I've been thinking," he said, pouring his own cup. "Cottonwood Springs might not be the safest place for you right now. If the Carson gang is operating in the area, they might return to town." Sarah's hand trembled slightly, causing the coffee to slosh in her cup. "I don't have anywhere else to go. Silver Creek Ranch is always looking for help. The owner, Mr. Donovan, is a good man. His wife passed a few years back, and he's got 2 young daughters who could use a woman's guidance around the place. The cook, Mrs. Holloway, is getting on in years and complains she needs an extra pair of hands. You'd take me there." "A complete stranger," Matthew shrugged. "You seem decent enough. Besides, I'm a fair judge of character, have to be in my line of work." "And what exactly is your line of work, Mr. O'Brien?" Just a cowhand, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Foreman at Silver Creek. And occasionally I help the territorial marshal track troublemakers." He tapped the badge partially concealed beneath his vest. Sarah's eyes widened. "You're a lawman, deputy marshal when duty calls. The territory's big and law enforcement is spread thin. Many of us wear 2 hats out here." This revelation cast their encounter in a new light. No wonder he'd been so willing to help her, it was part of his duty. The thought was both reassuring and, strangely, a bit disappointing. If you're a lawman, will you go after the Carson gang for what they did to my home? Matthew's expression hardened. Been tracking them for months. Your homestead wasn't the first they've hit, and I aim to make sure it's the last. Sarah set her cup down, suddenly determined. Then I accept your offer, Deputy O'Brien. I'll go to Silver Creek Ranch. Matthew nodded once, seeming pleased with her decision. We should get moving. It's a fair distance, and I'd like to reach the ranch before nightfall. After a quick breakfast of hardtack and jerky, Matthew saddled his horse and secured his gear. He looked at Sarah, then at the cradle she still held protectively. May I? He asked, holding out his hands. Reluctantly, Sarah passed him the cradle. With careful movements, Matthew used some spare leather straps to secure it to his saddle. It'll ride safe there, he assured her. Then, in a move that caught her by surprise, he offered his hand to help her mount. You'll ride in front. Copper here is strong enough for two, especially since you're hardly bigger than a minute. Sarah hesitated only briefly before accepting his help. His hands were strong and calloused as they encircled her waist, lifting her effortlessly onto the horse. A moment later, he swung up behind her, his chest warm against her back as he reached around her for the reins. The intimacy of their position made Sarah's cheeks flush. It had been months since she'd been this close to a man, not since Thomas's death. She sat rigidly, unsure where to place her hands. You can hold onto the saddle horn, Matthew suggested, seeming to sense her discomfort. And don't worry, I'm not in the habit of taking liberties with young ladies under my protection. I didn't think you were, Sarah replied quickly, though in truth, the thought had crossed her mind. She wasn't naive about the dangers a woman alone could face, even from supposed protectors. They set off at a steady pace, Matthew guiding the horse confidently through the rugged terrain. As they rode, Sarah gradually relaxed, the rhythm of the horse's gait and Matthew's solid presence behind her offering a strange comfort. Tell me about Silver Creek, she said after a while, partly to distract herself from her grief, partly out of genuine curiosity about her potential new home. It's a good spread, over 10,000 acres of prime grazing land. Mr. Donovan built it up from nothing after the war. Started with just 50 head of cattle and a broken-down cabin. Now it's one of the biggest ranches in the territory. We run nearly 2,000 head of cattle and employ 15 hands year-round, more during roundup season. And his daughters, how old are they? Emma's 8 and Charlotte's 6. Smart as whips, both of them, but running wild since their mama passed. Mr. Donovan does his best, but ranching's a full-time job and the girls need more attention than he can give. What happened to their mother? Matthew's voice softened. Influenza 3 winters ago. Hit the territory hard that year. Mrs. Donovan had been helping tend to sick families in the area. By the time she fell ill herself, she was too weak to fight it off. That's terrible, Sarah murmured, thinking of her own parents' deaths from fever. Those poor girls. They're resilient like their father, but they need a woman's influence. Mrs. Holloway does what she can, but she's got her hands full with the cooking and managing the household. Sarah found herself picturing the 2 little girls growing up without a mother's guidance. Perhaps at Silver Creek she could find not just employment, but purpose, something to fill the void left by her losses. They rode through the day, stopping occasionally to rest the horse and stretch their legs. Matthew shared his canteen and provisions freely, though Sarah noticed he always took less for himself, ensuring she had enough. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they crested a rise, and Matthew drew the horse to a halt. There it is, he said, pointing to the valley below. Silver Creek Ranch. Sarah gasped at the sight. The ranch spread across the valley, bordered by a winding creek that glinted silver in the late afternoon light. A large 2-story house stood proudly at the center, surrounded by various outbuildings, corrals, and a bunkhouse. Cattle dotted the surrounding pastures, and smoke curled invitingly from the main house's chimney. It's beautiful, she breathed. Home, Matthew said simply, a note of pride in his voice. Come on. Mrs. Holloway always puts on a good spread for supper, and I reckon you could use a proper meal. As they rode into the ranch yard, several cowboys looked up from their tasks, raising hands in greeting to Matthew. A tall, broad-shouldered man with silver threading his dark hair emerged from the barn, striding toward them with purpose. That's Mr. Donovan, Matthew murmured as he brought the horse to a stop. O'Brien, didn't expect you back so soon, the rancher called. His gaze shifted to Sarah, curiosity evident in his weathered features. Matthew dismounted first, then reached up to help Sarah down. Her legs felt wobbly after the long ride, and she swayed slightly, grateful for his steadying hand on her elbow. Mr. Donovan, this is Miss Sarah Jameson, Matthew said formally. Her homestead was hit by the Carson gang yesterday, burned everything to the ground. Donovan's expression darkened. Those bastards are getting bolder. Sorry for your trouble, Miss Jameson. Sarah nodded her thanks, suddenly feeling very small and out of place. She needs work, sir, Matthew continued. I thought perhaps Mrs. Holloway could use help in the house and the girls. He let the sentence hang. Donovan studied Sarah intently, his gaze not unkind but assessing. You have experience with children, Miss Jameson? I helped raise my younger siblings, sir. They died in the fever outbreak 3 years ago along with my parents. Sympathy flickered across the rancher's face. I'm sorry to hear that. He seemed to come to a decision. We can certainly use another pair of hands around here, especially female ones. The position includes room and board plus $10 a month. It was a generous offer, more than Sarah had dared hope for. Thank you, Mr. Donovan. I'd be grateful for the opportunity. Donovan nodded once, then turned his attention back to Matthew. Get Miss Jameson settled, then come see me in the study. I want a full report on what you learned in Fort Benton. As Donovan walked away, Matthew moved to untie the cradle from his saddle. Let's get you inside. Mrs. Holloway will show you to your room. Sarah reached for the cradle, her fingers brushing against Matthew's as he handed it to her. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, a moment of connection that sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. Thank you, she said softly, for everything. Matthew ducked his head slightly, seemingly embarrassed by her gratitude. Just doing what needed doing, Miss Jameson, nothing more. But as he led her toward the main house, Sarah sensed it was indeed something more, something neither of them fully understood yet. The main house of Silver Creek Ranch was far grander than any home Sarah had ever entered. Polished wood floors gleamed beneath wool rugs, and the furnishings, while practical, spoke of quality and care. Mrs. Holloway, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and keen eyes, met them in the foyer, her gaze immediately assessing Sarah from head to toe. So you're the girl Matthews brought home, she said, her voice brisk but not unfriendly. Land's sake, child, you look like you've been dragged behind a wild horse. Mrs. Holloway, Matthew said, his tone respectful but firm, Miss Jameson lost everything to the Carson gang yesterday. Mr. Donovan's agreed she can work here, helping with the girls and in the house. The older woman's expression softened slightly. Well then, you're welcome here, Miss Jameson. We'll get you settled and fed. Nothing puts the world to rights like a hot meal and a clean bed. Thank you, Sarah replied, still clutching her cradle. Mrs. Holloway's eyes lingered on the wooden cradle. Expecting, are you? No, Sarah said quickly, a flush rising to her cheeks. It was made by my father, it's all I have left. Understanding dawned in the older woman's eyes. Well, it's a fine piece of craftsmanship. Perhaps one day it'll serve its purpose. Her gaze flickered briefly between Sarah and Matthew, an unspoken speculation that made Sarah's blush deepen. I'd best report to Mr. Donovan, Matthew said, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents. Mrs. Holloway will take good care of you, Miss Jameson. With a tip of his hat, he turned and strode down the hallway, his spurs jingling faintly with each step. Sarah watched him go, a strange mixture of gratitude and something else, something she wasn't ready to examine stirring within her. Come along, child. Mrs. Holloway said, gesturing for Sarah to follow. "The girls are washing up for supper. You can meet them once you're presentable yourself." She led Sarah upstairs to a small but comfortable bedroom at the end of the hallway. A simple iron bed stood beneath a window overlooking the ranch yard, with a washstand, chest of drawers, and small writing desk completing the furnishings. "This will be your room," Mrs. Holloway explained. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and private. The girls' rooms are just down the hall, and mine is at the top of the stairs should you need anything in the night." Sarah placed the cradle carefully on the chest of drawers, then ran a hand over the quilt covering the bed. After months of struggling alone at the homestead, sleeping on a thin pallet with only threadbare blankets for comfort, this room seemed luxurious beyond measure. "It's perfect," she said, voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you, all of you, for such kindness." Mrs. Holloway's expression softened further. "There's water in the pitcher for washing. I'll find you a clean dress to wear until we can see about getting you some proper clothes. Supper's in 30 minutes sharp." Left alone, Sarah moved to the washstand and poured water into the basin. As she scrubbed the dirt and soot from her face and hands, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror hanging above. The face that looked back at her was thinner than she remembered, with shadows beneath her eyes speaking of grief and hardship. Yet beneath the exhaustion, she could see something else, a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Dressed in a borrowed blue calico that hung slightly loose on her frame, Sarah made her way downstairs, following the sounds of voices and the enticing aroma of cooking food. The dining room contained a long oak table, already set with plates and cutlery. Two young girls with matching chestnut braids sat side by side, whispering and giggling together. They fell silent when Sarah entered, regarding her with identical curious expressions. Mr. Donovan stood at the head of the table, with Matthew to his right. Both men rose as Sarah entered the room. "Girls, this is Miss Jameson," Mr. Donovan said. "She'll be helping Mrs. Holloway around the house and looking after you two scamps when needed." The older of the two girls slid from her chair and approached Sarah with the confidence of a child accustomed to meeting new people. "I'm Emma Donovan," she announced, extending a small hand. "I'm 8 years old and I can already ride better than Billy Jenkins, and he's 11. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she shook the girl's hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Emma." The younger girl remained in her seat, regarding Sarah with more caution. "That's Charlotte," Emma explained. "She's shy with strangers, but she'll warm up once she knows you won't make her eat turnips or brush her hair too hard." Matthew made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, quickly covered by a cough when Mr. Donovan shot him a look. "Take a seat, Miss Jameson," the rancher said, gesturing to the empty chair across from Matthew. "Mrs. Holloway's beef stew is not to be missed, especially after a long ride." Supper was a lively affair, with Emma chattering almost continuously, peppering Sarah with questions about her life. Sarah answered as honestly as she could while omitting the most traumatic details, conscious of the young ears at the table. Throughout the meal, she was aware of Matthew watching her, his blue eyes thoughtful whenever she glanced his way. After the meal, when the girls had been sent upstairs to prepare for bed, Mr. Donovan invited Sarah to join him, Matthew, and Mrs. Holloway in the study to discuss her duties at the ranch. The rancher's study was a masculine space, with leather-bound books lining one wall and a large desk dominating the room. "Mrs. Holloway will show you the household routines," Donovan explained as he poured brandy for himself and Matthew, offering tea to the women. "The girls have lessons with Mrs. Peterson from town 3 days a week, but they need supervision the rest of the time. Emma's headstrong and Charlotte needs drawing out of her shell." "I understand, sir," Sarah said. "I'm good with children and I'm willing to learn whatever else is required of me." "Matthew tells me you're handy with needle and thread," Mrs. Holloway commented. "That'll be useful. These cowboys tear through clothes like they're made of paper." "I can sew, cook, clean, garden, and I know basic figures for keeping household accounts," Sarah said. My mother made sure I could manage a home properly. Donovan nodded approvingly. Sounds like you'll be a fine addition to Silver Creek, Miss Jameson. He turned to Matthew. O'Brien will be leaving again in a few days. The territorial marshal wants his help tracking the Carson gang. Sarah's heart constricted at the news. Though she'd known Matthew only a day, the thought of him riding off to confront the dangerous outlaws who had destroyed her home filled her with dread. How long will you be gone? She asked before she could stop herself. Matthew's eyes met hers across the room. Hard to say. Could be a week, could be longer, depends on how well we can track them. They're dangerous men, she said softly. Please be careful. Something flickered in Matthew's gaze, surprise, perhaps, at her concern. Always am, Miss Jameson. The conversation turned to other ranch matters, and eventually, Mrs. Holloway suggested it was time for Sarah to retire. You've had a trying day, child. Best get some rest. Work starts early around here. As Sarah bid everyone good night, Matthew rose from his chair. If you don't mind, I'll walk Miss Jameson up. I'd like a word. Outside her bedroom door, Matthew stopped, removing his hat and holding it in his hands. In the soft lamplight of the hallway, Sarah noticed for the first time a thin scar running along his jawline, partially hidden by stubble. I wanted to make sure you're settling in all right, he said, his voice lowered to avoid disturbing the now sleeping girls. Everyone has been very kind, Sarah replied. I can't thank you enough for bringing me here. Matthew nodded, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. About the Carson gang, he said after a pause. I need to ask you something, and it might be difficult. Sarah steeled herself. What is it? Did you get a look at any of them? Anything that might help identify them? Sarah closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember details from that terrible day. There were 5 of them. The leader had a red bandana and a scar across his nose. Another had a missing front tooth. I could see it when he smiled as they set fire to the barn. One wore a gray duster even in the heat. Matthew's expression grew more intent with each detail. That's helpful. The man with the scar is Jake Carson himself. The one in the duster is probably his brother Ali. They killed my neighbor, Mr. Wilson, shot him in the back when he tried to run, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. His wife was screaming. She couldn't continue, the memories too raw. Matthew's hand moved as if to touch her arm but stopped short. I'm sorry to make you relive it, but every detail helps. Sarah looked up at him, determination replacing horror in her eyes. Find them, Matthew, make them pay for what they've done. I intend to, he promised, his voice hardening. Justice catches up to everyone eventually. A silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Finally, Matthew cleared his throat. Get some rest, Sarah. Tomorrow's a new beginning. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made something flutter in her chest. Good night, Matthew. As she closed her bedroom door behind her, Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the star-filled Montana sky. For the first time since smoke had filled the horizon of her homestead, she felt something close to peace. Silver Creek might not be the life she had planned, but perhaps it could become a home. Her eyes fell on the cradle sitting atop the chest of drawers. Once a symbol of a future lost, could it now represent a future yet to be discovered? Life at Silver Creek quickly settled into a rhythm for Sarah. She rose each morning before dawn to help Mrs. Holloway prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, supervised the girls' chores and play when they weren't at lessons, and spent afternoons tending to mending and other household tasks. The work was hard but satisfying, and the routine helped keep her grief at bay. The girls, especially Emma, had taken to her immediately. Even shy Charlotte had begun to open up, often seeking Sarah out to read stories or help with her sampler. Sarah found that caring for the children filled a void in her heart she hadn't realized was there. Each evening, as the household settled, Sarah would sit in her room with the cradle on her lap, rubbing its smooth wood with beeswax to keep it preserved. Sometimes she would imagine what might have been the baby she might have had with Thomas, but increasingly, her thoughts turned to possibilities rather than lost dreams. Matthew had ridden out 4 days after bringing her to Silver Creek, joining a posse led by the territorial marshal. Before leaving, he had come to find her in the kitchen garden where she was helping Mrs. Holloway harvest late summer vegetables. "I came to say goodbye," he'd said, hat in hand, the morning sun highlighting the gold flecks in his blue eyes. Sarah had straightened, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron. "How long do you think you'll be gone?" "Can't say for certain. Carson and his men are slippery, but we've got good information this time." His eyes had lingered on her face as if memorizing it. "You'll be safe here." "It's not my safety I'm worried about," she'd replied softly. A ghost of a smile had touched his lips. "Concerned for my welfare, Miss Jameson? Someone should be. You don't seem concerned enough yourself." He chuckled then, a warm sound that had sent an unexpected thrill through her. "I'll be careful. Got good reasons to come back in one piece." The memory of that conversation sustained Sarah through the weeks that followed, even as worry gnawed at her whenever she allowed herself to dwell on the dangers Matthew faced. She threw herself into her work with even greater vigor, earning praise from both Mrs. Holloway and Mr. Donovan. "You're a blessing to this household," the rancher had told her one evening after she'd successfully coaxed Charlotte into reciting her lessons without her usual reticence. "The girls are happier than I've seen them in a long time." Sarah had blushed at the compliment. "They're wonderful children. It's easy to care for them." Autumn progressed, painting the surrounding landscape in golds and reds. The air grew crisp, and preparations began for the coming winter. Still, there was no word from Matthew or the posse. Sarah tried not to imagine the worst, but each passing day made it harder to maintain hope. Then, on a cold October morning 6 weeks after Matthew's departure, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone to the ranch yard. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she recognized Matthew's Appaloosa among the riders, but her relief quickly turned to alarm when she saw him slumped in the saddle, supported by another man. "Matthew," she cried, rushing forward as the riders entered the yard. The territorial marshal, a grizzled man with a silver star pinned to his vest, looked down at her. "You must be Miss Jameson. O'Brien talked about you." "What happened to him?" she demanded, reaching for Matthew as ranch hands helped ease him from the saddle. "Took a bullet meant for me," the marshal said grimly. "Got Carson, though, him and 3 of his gang, 2 more in custody." Sarah barely registered this news, her attention fixed on Matthew's pale face and the bloodied bandage wrapped around his left shoulder. "Get him inside," she ordered the ranch hands. Quickly, Mrs. Holloway appeared at her side. "I'll prepare his room and fetch hot water and bandages." While Mr. Donovan spoke with the marshal, Sarah helped settle Matthew in his room in the foreman's cabin, a small but well-built structure near the main house. His skin burned with fever, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring incoherently. The ranch doctor, summoned from town, arrived by nightfall. He examined the wound, cleaned it thoroughly, and replaced the bandages, his expression grave. "The bullet's out, which is good, but infection has set in," he explained to Sarah, who had refused to leave Matthew's side. "Next 48 hours will tell. Keep the fever down as best you can. If he makes it through 2 nights, he'll likely recover." For 2 days and nights, Sarah barely left the cabin, sponging Matthew's fevered brow with cool water, forcing broth between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and changing his bandages with gentle hands. Mrs. Holloway brought food she barely touched and finally insisted on taking over the vigil for a few hours so Sarah could rest. "You'll do him no good if you collapse yourself," the older woman admonished. "Get some sleep. I'll call you if there's any change." Reluctantly, Sarah returned to the main house, but sleep eluded her. Instead, she sat by her window, watching the light in Matthew's cabin and praying as she hadn't since her parents' deaths. When dawn broke, she was already dressed and hurrying back to his side. She found him awake, pale but clear-eyed, propped against his pillows while Mrs. Holloway spooned broth into his mouth. "Sarah," he said, his voice weak but steady, The sound of her name on his lips sent relief flooding through her so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. "You're awake," she managed. Mrs. Holloway set down the bowl with a knowing smile. "I'll leave you two to talk, but not too long, mind. He needs rest." When they were alone, Sarah moved to sit in the chair beside his bed. "You scared me half to death, Matthew O'Brien." A faint smile crossed his lips. "Didn't mean to. The marshal said you took a bullet meant for him." Matthew shifted slightly, wincing. "Man has 6 children, couldn't let him die on my account." "And what about the people who care about you?" Sarah asked, unable to keep a tremor from her voice. "Did you think about how they'd feel if you died?" His eyes, though tired, focused intently on her face. "Didn't know there were people who cared that much." "Well, there are," she said fiercely. "So don't you dare do something so foolish again." A charged silence fell between them. Matthew reached out, his hand finding hers where it rested on the edge of the bed. "I heard you," he said softly. "When the fever was highest, heard your voice calling me back." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. "You needed to come back, the ranch needs you, the girls adore you, and I." She hesitated, suddenly afraid of the depth of her feelings. "And you?" he prompted, his fingers tightening around hers. Before she could answer, the door opened and the doctor entered for his morning check. "Good to see you awake, O'Brien," he said briskly. "Let's have a look at that wound." Sarah reluctantly withdrew her hand and stepped back to allow the doctor access. "I'll come back later," she promised, meeting Matthew's eyes one last time before slipping from the room. Matthew's recovery progressed steadily over the following weeks. At first he chafed at the restrictions placed on him, unused to inactivity. Sarah visited daily, bringing meals, fresh bandages, and news from the ranch. Often, she brought Emma and Charlotte, whose chatter and antics never failed to lift his spirits. As November settled over the territory, bringing the first dusting of snow, Matthew was finally deemed well enough to return to light duties. Sarah watched from the kitchen window one morning as he walked slowly around the corral, inspecting the horses. Though still favoring his left side, his stride was becoming more confident each day. "You watch that man like a hawk watches a field mouse," Mrs. Holloway observed, coming to stand beside her. Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm just making sure he doesn't overdo things." "MMMHMM," the older woman hummed skeptically. "And I suppose that's why you blush every time he enters a room, or why he finds excuses to come to the house 3 times a day when once would do." "Mrs. Holloway," Sarah protested, embarrassed at being so transparent. The cook's expression softened. "Child, I've lived long enough to recognize when 2 people are dancing around their feelings. Life's too short for such nonsense, especially out here." "It's not that simple," Sarah sighed. "I was engaged before. When Thomas died, I thought I'd never feel that way again. And then everything happened so quickly with the homestead and coming here. The heart knows what it wants, even when the head isn't ready to admit it," Mrs. Holloway said wisely. "That cradle you cherish so, maybe it's time to think of it not as a reminder of what you've lost, but as a promise of what might be." Sarah watched as Matthew stopped to scratch the ears of his Appaloosa, the morning sun glinting off his hair. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly, "of loving again." "Or of losing again." "Both." Mrs. Holloway patted her hand. "Fear's a poor reason not to reach for happiness when it's standing right in front of you." That evening, as twilight painted the mountains purple against the darkening sky, Sarah wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and walked to the small rise behind the main house. It was a spot she'd discovered during her first week at Silver Creek, a quiet place to think and watch the sunset. To her surprise, Matthew was already there, seated on a fallen log, his hat beside him. He looked up at her approach, a smile warming his features. "Great minds think alike," he said, moving over to make room for her. Sarah hesitated only briefly before joining him. "How's the shoulder?" "Stiff, but healing. Doc says I'll have full use of it again by spring." He studied her profile in the fading light. "You've been quiet these past few days." "I've had a lot on my mind." "Anything you want to share?" Sarah gathered her courage, Mrs. Holloway's words echoing in her thoughts. "When you were shot," she began slowly, I realized something that terrified me. Matthew turned to face her more fully, giving her his complete attention. "What's that?" "That I couldn't bear to lose you." The words hung in the crisp evening air between them. After Thomas, after my family, after the homestead. I told myself I wouldn't let myself care that deeply again. It hurts too much when it's taken away. "Sarah," Matthew said softly, reaching for her hand. "But then I realized," she continued, her voice strengthening, "that closing yourself off from caring is just another kind of loss, a choice to lose something before it's even had a chance to grow." Matthew's fingers interlaced with hers. "I felt the same after my wife died," he said quietly. Sarah looked up, surprised. "Your wife," he nodded. "Rebecca. 7 years ago now, childbirth, lost her and the baby both." Understanding bloomed within Sarah. This was the loss he'd alluded to during their first night by the campfire, the everything he'd lost once before. "I'm so sorry, Matthew." "I didn't know. Not something I talk about much," he admitted. "For years after, I just existed, did my job, built a reputation as a capable hand, eventually became foreman here, took on deputy duties because it gave me purpose, but I wasn't really living." "What changed?" His eyes, intensely blue in the twilight, held hers. "Found a woman clutching a cradle by the side of the road, woman who'd lost everything but still had the courage to keep going." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. "Matthew." "I've been falling in love with you since that first night, Sarah Jameson. Tried to talk myself out of it. Told myself it was too soon for you, that you needed time to heal. But nearly dying has a way of clarifying things." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, but they were tears of a different sort than she'd grown accustomed to. "I think I've been falling in love with you too," she whispered. Matthew's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a summer breeze. "I don't have much to offer beyond what you see. I'm just a cowboy with some law enforcement duties on the side, but if you'd consider it, I'd like to court you properly." Sarah leaned into his touch. "I'd like that very much." Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Matthew leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, unhurried, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Sarah felt as though something that had been broken within her had begun to mend. "There's something I want to show you," she said. "Will you come with me?" Curious, Matthew followed her back to the main house and up to her room. There, sitting in a place of honor by the window, was the cradle, polished to a warm glow in the lamplight. "My father made this for my future," Sarah said, running her fingers along its smooth edge. "For the longest time, I thought that future died with Thomas. But now I'm starting to think maybe the future he envisioned for me is still possible, just different than I imagined." Matthew moved to stand beside her, his arm slipping around her waist. "Different can be good," he said softly. "Yes," Sarah agreed, leaning against him. "Different can be very good indeed." Spring came to Montana in a rush of green, transforming the snow-covered landscape into a vibrant tapestry of wildflowers and fresh grass. Silver Creek Ranch bustled with activity as calving season brought new life to the herds. On a perfect May morning, beneath an arch of wild roses in the ranch yard, Sarah stood before Matthew in a simple white dress sewn by her own hands. Emma and Charlotte, serving as flower girls, watched with wide grins as Mr. Donovan, in his capacity as Justice of the Peace, pronounced them husband and wife. As friends and ranch hands cheered, Matthew pulled Sarah close for their first kiss as a married couple. "Never thought I'd be grateful to the Carson gang," he murmured against her lips, "but if they hadn't burned your homestead, you might never have come into my life." Sarah smiled up at him, joy radiating from her entire being. Life has strange ways of leading us where we need to be. That evening, after the celebration had wound down and they were alone in the foreman's cabin, now expanded and improved to become their marital home, Matthew led Sarah to the bedroom. There, in the corner by the window, stood the cradle, lovingly restored and lined with soft blankets. "A proper place for it at last," he said, watching as Sarah ran her fingers over the familiar wood. "Think it'll be needed soon?" Sarah turned to him, eyes shining with love and hope. "I think its time is coming," she said, placing his hand over her still flat stomach. "Perhaps sooner than you think." Matthew's expression transformed from confusion to wonder. "You mean?" Sarah nodded, laughing as he swept her into his arms with a joyous whoop. As he spun her around in the room that would soon welcome their child, Sarah marveled at how life could change so completely in less than a year. From a woman left with nothing but a cradle and shattered dreams, she had become a woman with everything: love, family, home, and a future bright with promise. And the cradle that had once symbolized all she had lost now stood ready to cradle all she had gained. Outside their window, Montana stars shone down on Silver Creek Ranch, bearing witness to the truth that sometimes the end of one dream is merely the beginning of another one even more beautiful than could have been imagined.